With the imposition of new tariffs from the United States on China, Europe, and potentially more, only months since the longshoremen strike, there seems to be no end to the reshaping of global supply chains, as companies seek solutions to adapt and build resilience where disruption has become the new norm. The answer might lie in the electronic bill of lading. Hi, this is Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News here, and welcome to the latest episode of the Seatrade Maritime podcast. Today, you'll be hearing from Bertrand Chen, CEO of GSBN, who will be talking about the launch of a new report from GSBN, which sheds light on some interesting developments coming out of China around electronic bill of lading, or eBL, adoption, and more importantly, what it means for global adoption. He will also be talking about why the eBL has a new role to play in this new normal as a data container. Welcome back to the podcast, Bertrand.
Thanks, Marcus.
Firstly, just to set the scene, talked about how global trade is entering a new era of sort of trade 3.0. What do you mean by this?
I think really last year or the last few years, right, the industry has seen a lot of disruption. And I guess when I use the word trade 3.0 is different phase what I see that the global trade has been in. So trade 1.0, the way I define that is when you first have essentially shipping. Right, so you don't have to do barter trade in a certain region. You can use a large vessel to move goods from one location to another location. And then one of the key innovation around that is, in my opinion, the bill of lading, letter of credits, different type of legal instrument and paper that you use to conduct trade. And then trade 2.0 is really the advent of containerization. And that really kicked in, I think, in 1956, right, with the Malcolm McLean US. But really took probably 20, 30 years to really take shape. And then was really on steroid over the last, let's say, 30, 40 years with the entry of China in WTO. So right now, what we see while we talk about trade 3.0, first off is you have increasingly disruption. And the example could be COVID. It could be the Red Sea crisis. It could be all the incoming tariff and also the strike from the longshoremen, right? So a lot of disruption. It seems like every 2 years, there's a disruption that's popping up. And trade is becoming harder and harder to manage. The second thing also is with increasing e-commerce, you have much more complicated trade flow where it's not as used to be, right? Where you have a large BCO ordering and then the retailer. These kind of flows start to change quite dramatically. And that's what we might trade 3.0. Plus, you also have increasingly more regulation and compliance, where you have to do declaration about the goods that's coming from different location, regulation in European Union, regulation in United States, and etc. So one example, the most recent one you can think of is the tariff imposed by Trump administration, but also the imposition of reversal in a very quick term. Feels like you're getting whiplash every 2 days, right? And it's very hard to follow what's going on. And I think one thing that really characterizes this change, in my opinion, right now, what's happening is moving goods is actually really, really easy, right? With container, but moving data and using the data to clear those hurdles is becoming increasingly difficult. And one key example you can look at the recent weeks is what happened with the de minimis exemption cancellation and then put back in place because the system are not ready to handle it. So then you have 1 million package per day. It's just the system not built for that. And I think that's a key issue that we see. So if I want to leave the audience with a picture in mind is it used to be before you have the container, stiff doors on the dock and they're moving goods on the hull of the ship. Today, it's replaced by people who are keying data and do data entry in different locations at the import level, export level, and exchanging information. And that's what's to some degree preventing the resilience of this industry. Because on the physical side, on the vessel, on the container, I think the industry is quite resilient. But on the data exchange, because of the fragmentation and then the different approach in different countries, it's actually really difficult. That's where potentially you have a much bigger hurdle.
So essentially, you've got actually what's a highly efficient industry physically, but then you've got constraints around regulation.
The digital side.
Yeah, the digital side. Now, this is something that you explore more in this latest report that's come out. And one of the things you focus on is eBL adoption in China. Why is that? Why is that important?
Yeah, so I think there's something I can explain a bit more later on is I believe eBL is really the opportunity to solve this problem of data coordination, of exchanging data across supply chain, across a fragmented supply chain. The reason we put this report out was we see EBL adoption in China as a harbinger for what's to come, because there's a lot of interesting thing that's really coming up in China these days. There's a lot of new thing happening in China. I think it pays dividend to actually pay attention to what's going on there. So maybe quickly give us some context for the audience about the EBL. Not everybody is expert in EBL, right? So there's currently a tremendous support, both from the industry, from the regulators, from the legal aspect, to push for the EBL adoption. That came after the COVID-19 crisis, where essentially people realized if you rely still on paper process for the bill of lading, it's just not possible to handle that when you have lockdown situation under COVID. Now, obviously, that take a couple forms. So number one is the shipping line through the DCSA, the container line, has enacted 100% adoption with a target of 2030 as the date by which every paper will be replaced by a digital equivalent, the EBL. BIMCO, which is the Association of the Bulk Carrier, has similar pledge, which is a 25% by 2025. And they also formed something called the FIT Alliance, the Future of International Trade Alliance, I think, with other organizations to do the same thing. So that's the industry itself. On the legal aspect, you have also the UN Seatrade, the UN law, who adopts a new framework, a model law called MLETR, which enable the replacement of paper by digital documents. And that there's a couple jurisdictions that pass the law. So the biggest example is in 2023, it was the UK law, right? The ETDA, the Electronic Trade Document Act, that was enacted in September by King Charles. So all that does a very good initiative to drive the adoption. However, the bad news is today, global adoption is still fairly low. So I think the latest survey from DCSA or from the FIT Alliance is only 5% global adoption. So that's still really, really low. Now, the good news in the state of affairs is in China, the adoption for some carriers is really high. It's actually 20%. So it's 4 times the average we see globally. And that's what prompted us to organize this event, to understand a bit more what's really driving the much higher adoption than average, and also to meet with the folks doing that in China. What was super surprising to us is when we first have an idea to organize that, we didn't really know how many people would show up, right? Election bill of lading is a very niche subject, and it's not really a cup of tea for most people. But actually, we managed to get more than 120 participants in a hotel in Shanghai. In terms of presentation, you have the top 5 carriers, so Maersk, MSC, COSCO, CMA, Hapag-Lloyd. So all the biggest name you have some representative. We have actually a lot of customers, freight forwarders, BCO in different verticals. We have banks, insurance company. So it was actually really well-attended event, which is really surprising to us. Actually, we didn't expect that much in attendance, or at least as broad. And there were a lot of interesting subjects discussed. And the main takeaway from China is there's a lot of things happening, but it's much more complicated than just, hey, we switch from a paper document to a digital document.
Okay, there's quite a lot to unpack in there, actually. I think I'm going to take this sort of stage by stage. Firstly, I mean, EBL is by no means a new concept. And you said global adoption is still only at 5%. What are the hurdles to that adoption?
I think the first hurdle I would say was legal. The perception was legal, right? So MLETR addressed it. Essentially, from a legal aspect, anyone can set EBL. Number 2 is you needed all the participants to accept at the same time to use EBL. The advantage of paper is if you use paper, that anyone can use it. So literally, I give you this piece of paper, and it has been working for hundreds of years. You switch to EBL, say, okay, you need you to log in the system in the solution. You need to accept the solution. You need to trust that the solution is safe. There are a lot of hurdle. In the past, I think before COVID, the uptake was really on a couple of solutions in market where they managed to build a sort of network effect. So the example would be metal in oil and gas in some specific area, and mostly in bulk. But in the container side, I think that hasn't been the case. So now I think the big push where I see the adoption really scaling up faster and faster is on the container side. And that's where adoption in China actually is quite critical, quite key, because China is a very big exporter, now increasingly also an importer. And then the drive is really coming from there.
Okay, now you said you're seeing that adoption take up, I think you said 20% in China. What's driving that in China compared to the rest of the world? And also, you said it was more complicated than just going from paper to electronic. Could you give a bit more color on that and explain that?
So I think in China, the reason the adoption rate is higher, in our opinion, is there's a lot of policy support for it. So most of the eBL solution that came up in the most recent year are all blockchain based. And actually, China, from policy support, is very keen to support blockchain-based solution, which is not the case globally. So that's one reason I would say that the company in China are more willing to trust the electronic bill of lading that's based on blockchain compared to some other location. The second thing is it's also a matter of using that across the different element of the supply chain. So a lot of the export coming from China to US, which is a very big flow, today actually rely on eBL. That's actually one of the adoption we see the most. And the reason for that is a lot of the import process in US is a bit risky for small and medium-sized freight forwarders. So that's one leg of adoption that we see a lot of flow coming. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons China adoption is much higher than elsewhere.
You say about that sort of risky part there for SMEs exporting from China into the US. Presumably that's going to get more complex with the scenarios we described earlier with tariffs and so forth.
Yeah, so the way I look at eBL is it's really the best product for an exporter, for a shipper, because you retain the control of your cargo until some event is fulfilled effectively, right? So that's how you think about it. In the past, you can only have a couple choices, right? So if the consignee is someone you trust, you can use a seaway bill, and then you don't have to worry too much about that. Or you use telex release, which is really a paper BL, but you retain the paper BL and you surrender at the port of loading, and then they send a telex message to release it at the port destination. And the last one, which is original bill of lading, a piece of paper that you ship, you courier, to destination. So those are the three choices. But in my opinion, the eBL as it exists today can fulfill all the requirement of the three scenarios. And as a shipper, you don't take that much risk. It's basically just a solution. You have a solution that you can access, you can do that. From a shipping line also, it's actually really, really great. So one funny anecdote from the conference, for the summit, is from one container carrier perspective, the reason they're pushing for eBL is their lawyers, right? So you don't expect that typically for digitization is a lawyer, the legal department, which is pushing for the adoption of new technology. But for these specific carriers, the biggest proponent for adopting eBL is actually the legal department. And the way they view that is if we don't use eBL, then you have to use other type of instruments to release the container, which actually open you to potentially more liabilities for misdelivery or lawsuit, right? And traditionally what happened, you use something called a letter of indemnity, LOI, in case that the bill of lading is lost or the bill of lading doesn't arrive on time. And even in case of a seaway bill, they can still be disputed, right? So from a legal aspect, the legal department of a carrier, if you use an eBL, it's a much better, it's a safer instrument than a paper one. And I think that's the reason you see a lot of uptake like this in China. Also globally, the reason you use eBL is for that reason.
Well, that's interesting that push came from a shipping line legal department, though. I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah.
Now, looking at the report that you've got coming out, one of the things that's talked about in there is the sort of concept of the eBL as a data container. Where does that come in?
So the reason we see eBL as a data container is the following. So when we talk to the shipping line, the value is very clear, right? So there's the simplify the process, the legal department. I think it's quite interesting. For the customer also, the early adopter is pretty easy to understand. They want to use it in case they lose the paper BL. It's very complicated to release the cargo. It can be quite expensive. They may incur detention demurrage. And there's also a lot of benefit around this kind of cost and loss. However, I would say for the next leg of adoption, for the broader group of shipper and consignee, this kind of advantage is not enough. Meaning that they're like, actually, I still prefer paper because I'm used to paper. So if you just go to them, and then that's what I see today when carriers are pushing for eBL adoption, they typically highlight three aspects, right? They say it's digital, right? So it's a better user experience. It's cheaper, which is not always true. Actually, it's not always true, but they would say it's cheaper. And then 3, it's better for the environment. And again, unfortunately, it is, I would call a spade a spade. Most of shipping companies does not care about the environment. They don't care if you have to print the piece of paper. And that's a reality. So all the early adopter that would adopt, I think what we see is it's pretty much done. The next leg of adoption, you need to create more value for the adopter of eBL. And I think that's one area where it has been, in my opinion, difficult to articulate the value of eBL to the end user. That's why with discussion with the customer, the bank, the insurance, we've reached on this concept. Actually, eBL as a data container is really another way to formulate the value of eBL. Because if you think about it, the eBL is to some degree a commoditized product. What really is valuable is what you do with it. And today, all the use case that the carrier pushing is very small in that scope, because it's just about you give me goods, I issue eBL, there's some transfer, and then surrender back to me, and then we're done. It's just a shipping line user flow. But actually, the eBL can be used in many other aspects, right? So what we think about the data container, which is borrowed the idea of container was able to create value by, instead of moving cargo piecemeal, you put in the box, and it's easier to handle to move the cargo to the train, to the truck, to the ship, and back to train and to truck, right? So that's the idea of container. Here, for the data, if we link it to the eBL, we can create the same effect. So what do you require for eBL as a data container to perform this role? I believe there's 3 characteristics you need to have. So first characteristic is a single location, single unit. You have all the information that's relevant to a shipment. There's a word that people like to use in technology, which I think is really a misnomer, and it's kind of a word that lost its meaning, but single source of truth, right? So a single location where you have all the truth about one shipment, so specific to a single shipment. The second aspect, which is I think very critical, is access control of the data. Because in one shipment, you have so many people who touch the shipment, you don't want everyone to see the same data. For very simple reason, the supply chain, the global trade is built with middlemen, right? And they all want to preserve the advantage for business reason, right? So if everybody sees everything, full transparency, then some of the business, maybe they don't exist anymore. So you need to give the industry a means to control the access to the data. And the last one, which I think is really something key that is not possible to create in the paper world, which is a timeline of the event that occurs. What I mean by the timeline is, so you have things that happen in the physical world, right? The box gets picked up, gets loaded in the ship, maybe this tram ship somewhere, then go to a train, etc. So you have the physical world. You have the payment world, where the shipper is paying the consignee. There's maybe financing thing that's happening. There is also the regulatory world, which is, okay, so it has cleared the customs. Some other activity has happened for declaration. So all these can be logged for the same shipment. And if you can do that as using eBL as the means to achieve this, then you can really simplify and improve the workflow. And that's a value that today is not possible at all using paper, right? It's not possible. So eBL, electronic format, is strictly superior to paper. And if you say, I still want to do paper, then I think you're crazy, right? So this, as an eBL, will solve a lot of other problems. But in order to do that, it's about connecting the bill of lading to the electronic bill of lading to banks, to insurance company, to customs, to payment gateway, to a lot of other actors. That's how you're going to create the value.
So are all those links there? There's a lot of parties involved in that.
I agree. So I think that's one, obviously, that the reason GSBN, so we're articulating that, we believe that we hopefully can help play this role. In order to achieve that, you don't need the eBL to be on GSBN, right? So that's not the claim that we're making. And a lot of other ways to achieve this. But we believe that the way GSBN is structured and GSBN is built, we can help achieve this, where if you have an eBL that's issued as a digital asset on GSBN, you can connect to all those parties and create this value. And something also that's interesting, maybe for the audience, is in the case of GSBN, we are the infrastructure, right? We actually do not offer EBL solution. So there's a company called IQX offer an EBL solution that's built on top of GSBN, and they focus on what makes their product good for their customer, which is the carrier, the user, wherever. It's their business. What we're focusing on is how can we expand the use case of EBL beyond just this very niche aspect, right? So how do you extend the value with banks, with the insurance, with terminal, with customs? That's the role we're playing. And I think this is something that's mutually beneficial. The more we can expand the use cases, the more the EBL app itself is powerful. And also, it needs to partner with other applications. So one key example I can highlight, for instance, is if you want to talk about payment. Over the last, I think, few years, there has been many attempts to have digital payment. But increasingly, what I think is interesting is with the new administration in the United States, with the Trump administration, they have a AI and crypto czar, right, David Sachs. And the first priority for them is to issue an act to regulate stablecoin. And the idea is it's to reinforce the primacy of US dollar but as a digital currency to make sure that the world can still trade on dollars and use a stablecoin. Now, if you have this payment stablecoin, what are the use cases? I think there's primarily three use cases you can do. One is for the financial market, which I actually don't think stablecoin makes that much a difference because the world is fairly digitized and financialized. For remittance, so you have the large worker and send money back to the country of origin. The last one, which I think is most interesting, is global trade. So if you can stablecoin to do payment between buyer and seller globally, the logical thing you need to connect to is electronic bill of lading. Because you have the transfer of the title of the cargo and you have a transfer of value of the payment. These two are logical. So if you can connect these two, then the adoption of EBL is a no-brainer because by adopting that, you can really simplify the flow of value. But that's just one use case, right? The other use case with the customs, with the banks for trade finance, with the insurance, that's even more reinforcing when you combine this.
So it's all about linking these different parties up and then the sort of use cases you can drive from that.
Correct.
Bertrand, you explained why EBL as a data container is important. Could you give a couple of specific use cases that were brought up at the event?
So at the event, there were two use cases that really gather a lot of feedback and people are quite enthusiastic to discuss more. So one of them is the multimodal freight transportation, MFTs. So actually what it is today you have more and more the sea leg, so shipping by sea, plus train, plus trucks. And the idea is maybe if you connect the sea and then the truck, you can create a more interesting type of shipping because it has advantage mostly on the decarbonization side. Because the maritime and then the train is actually better. And also you see some push, especially out of China with the One Belt One Road and a lot of things they're doing with the train connected to the sea leg. So why this use case is important with EBL is if you can have the bill of lading that's not paper-based, that's electronic for the sea leg, plus the bill of lading for the train, which is technically a house BL, typically, a freight for BL. If those can be connected, you can exchange data, then it becomes something that's very interesting because it can be financed. The bank are willing to finance the entire journey of the cargo. Insurance company can potentially expand the insurance coverage also. And then from the carbon footprint, the carbon emission side also, this is beneficial because then these more forms of transportation is not only better for the environment, but also you get financing for it. So that's, I think, one use case that's quite interesting. The second use case, and I think I kind of discussed a little bit before on the payment, but more than just payment, some banks are also identifying that EBL it could be potentially help them provide better user experience, especially in China. So let me explain a bit more. So China is actually a country where the currency is controlled, right? The RMB is not freely convertible in US dollar or other currency. So what happened is when this trade that happens, and there's an organization called SAFE, which is a regulator in China, who basically needs to validate the trade is genuine in order to authorize a financial FX transaction and whatnot. So then what happens is if you can have EBL and the banking payment, all those infrastructure connected together, then you may fast track the payment. You also will get a better service from a risk perspective for the bank, right? So all this, if they connect together, would improve the user experience for the corporate. And then one thing that's quite interesting that we've noticed is when you go to this event, people who typically participate are people on the supply chain side because they deal with the shipping line, right? They deal with the inventory. Do we have access to the container? Can I get on the ship? But increasingly, the value is not realized by the supply chain team. It's actually by the people in the finance team. Because the finance team control the payment, make sure that account receivable, account payable are matched, and that they actually more and more impacted by EBL. And I think that's also the thing that we notice is maybe sometime when a shipping line is going to pitch EBL to a company, to BCO, they're talking to the wrong people. They shouldn't be talking to the supply chain manager. They should be talking to the finance team, because the impact really is not just about I'm getting over the paper. Is your trade finance would potentially be improved drastically. It's cheaper for you to get financing. You have a better terms, and maybe you have lesser risk to do this. So that's, I think, another interesting use case that I think we couldn't have if we don't have this group of banks, insurance, and customer together in the same room. So that was actually another interesting take.
That's very interesting, and I think that point of making sure you're talking to the right group of people, be it in this case the finance department, which might not have been what people thought of originally. Let's just start wrapping this up. Now, I think early on you mentioned some fairly ambitious targets in terms of adoption. I think there was 100% by 2030 from one organization. Are we going to get there? What are the challenges that remain to eBL adoption, and what can China's experience tell us in terms of where we go from here?
So I believe those targets, it's actually very achievable, right? Because first off, it's still quite a few years down the road. 2030 is still at least 5 years, right? And I do believe in any technology will follow the adoption curve, right? Which is a curve like this. So I believe right now we are kind of at the inflection point where 2025 is a key year, in my opinion. And as we see the adoption really kick in, a lot of the, let's say, the people that are coming on the sideline waiting to adopt, they will start to say, we have to do something about it. The biggest hurdle I think I see right now is you have a couple carriers that are pushing quite aggressively. There's namely two big one, and it's the market pretty everyone knows is MSC and Costco. They are the one really pushing aggressively for the adoption, and a lot of the carrier I think behind are kind of more in the follower mode, which I understand, right? Because it's a disruptive technology, it's new, and this industry, I think a lot of people that kind of always want to not be the first one, they want to be the second one. They want to let someone else figure out what are the kinks and then adopt very quickly. But I think we are approaching a stage where the leader are kind of already establishing clearly what are the things and then how the fast follower can catch up to that. So I have no doubt that the network effect will start to kick in fairly soon. So 2025 for me is really where we hit the inflection point. The second thing, which I think also is a challenge right now and for the eBL adoption, is potentially what people call the risk of interoperability, right? So today there are 12 solutions that have been approved by IGPNI Club. So IGPNI Club is an insurance group. They approve a solution. Say, I will insure this solution. If it's a electronic bill of lading, I can insure it as if it's paper. So it's a important body to do that. And there's 12 solutions. And more recently, they basically say that we're not going to approve anymore, because if you fulfill two requirements, then automatically you're approved. So I think the risk now that I see is you may have too many solutions popping up. So you may have people who say, okay, so back in the days, I have to choose between CWBL, DX release, OBL, this solution, 12 solution, but now there's potentially 40 solutions to choose from. I have no idea what to do anymore, right? So I think that's potentially a risk that you may see. Also, because you have so many solutions, that will put a pressure on the price of eBL, which is great for the user, but maybe not great for the eBL solution provider, because commercially it becomes harder to justify as a business because there's so much competition, right? So that's, I think, some of the challenge potentially I can think of that's coming up. The way we try to address this is we think it's important for us to enable the adoption regardless which solution people choose, right? So on GSBN right now, there's one solution, IQX eBL. And if people use IQX eBL, great, support that. It's not really GSBN's mandate or KPI, it's really IQX product. But we want to make sure that if a user does not use IQX, they still have a way to transact eBL, and we can help build the bridge. So one thing that we've been working on very closely with ESS Docs, which is another eBL solution that's quite prominent, is to create this kind of bridge, what we call interoperability, right? And this interoperability framework has been approved by the GPNI Club. So now you have so many solutions, they all approve, but the interoperability, I think the only one that's approved is the ESS Docs to IQX, with GSBN playing a certain role. And by the way, this role can be played by another platform. It doesn't really matter, but we just want to enable this interoperability. We believe it will be quite critical. So that's one way we think the challenge can be addressed. And potentially what we see is the customer will have less hard decision to make. It's going to be obvious for them to adopt eBL because it's value coming from banks, coming from insurance, for payment, and what have you. And then also from a carrier perspective, when they go to the customer, they want to push them, it's easier for them to convince them to adopt. Today, I think for some of the carriers, it's not the most important thing for them, right? So they are struggling with other aspects. Documentation is not key for them. So a lot of them kind of I don't want to spend a lot of time to convince my customer. I just want to give them, this is a solution, this is best practice, and please adopt it. So I think that's one thing that we're going to see more and more, which is for the carriers, they do not want to spend that much time figuring that out, right? They just want to offer to the customer a solution that works, that scales well, and they can fulfill their needs. And that's really what we want to help them. Maybe one last interesting tidbit also for you is the industry bodies that's pushing for eBL. It's quite complicated right now. So one anecdote I have for you is 2 carriers at the event describe the adoption that they see in the same country. I won't name which country. There's one country, right? They both have agencies, business there. And they see drastically different adoption rates, uptake rates. And to me, that doesn't make sense, right? Because the way to operate the policy should be the same. And it shouldn't be because some carriers have stronger agency and stronger commercial, let's say, impact on their customer, that the adoption is higher than someone who potentially has slightly weaker presence there. It should be the policy of the country itself, right? Because this adoption of eBL is good for trade for the country. So I think what's still potentially lacking, and a challenge that GSBN cannot solve, the carrier cannot solve, is for each country, you need to have some policy level to understand, okay, so this eBL adoption is important for the good for this country, to facilitate trade, to have more ease of conducting business. And it shouldn't be the carriers today pushing those companies to adopt this solution, which is good for them, but they just don't want to do it because I prefer use paper. So that shouldn't be the carrier's job to push them. It should be really the local entity. And one body who's doing a lot of good work for that is the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, with the DSI. But I think it behooves a lot of countries, local administration to focus on this. This is something that's relatively easy for them to do. That would really change the future for trade for those businesses in these countries.
Great. There's a lot of things to be done there. So obviously interoperability is key. I think in that was certainly something I took away from what you just said there. It'd be really good to sort of come back and talk to you in a year or two and sort of like see where this has moved on and, if all these things are happening.
Sure.
And one thing I would like to do is I just recommend that you actually download a copy of the report. There'll be a link in the show notes to that. So please go to those if you want to have a read of the actual report. And Bertrand, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to our listeners today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Great. And look forward to talking to you again in future.